Thank you all for coming. This is Memoir Church. We're the first Sunday of every month for 1 hour, and we have beautiful writers in conversation with me. And then they read from their work for about 25 minutes. And then we invite you to ask them some questions or tell them what you thought for about 10 minutes. And we're really excited to have you. My name is Suze Allen, and shared stories is my passion. It's my purpose. I teach memoir writing. I host Memoir Church. I have private clients that I work with on their memoirs. I also am an editor for other kinds of books, but memoir is my passion because I feel like it connects us. It grows our empathy, compassion, and our humanity. And our knowledge. Everything expands when someone tells us their true story about who they are. And we all have many stories. We're not just one story. And that's why I love Memoir Church. Everybody brings these stories in from this certain time in their life or something that they were working on. And we're all blessed by it and edified. And so I'm very happy you're here. And so let's get started. We are going to, everybody, this is Henry Hank Greenspan. I just know him as Hank, so I'm going to just say that.
Hank
if that's
good.
Okay? Oops.
Hank is good. Yep.
Okay.
All right. Okay. So
this is thrilling. So I know Hank through Roland Tech, through Wednesday Gathering and Someone Speaking, his wonderful programs that are a bit on hiatus now, but he's going to let us know if and when they come back. And I've had the pleasure of hearing some of Hank's work for the theater and also some of his stories. And Hank, it's really great to have you here. I'm really thrilled. And so you're a psychologist, you're a playwright, and you've written this beautiful book, and we're hearing from a part of it called What Remains. So will you tell us the whole genesis of What Remains, please?
Sure. The book is actually two parts. We'll call it Act One, Act Two. Act One is this play called Remnants, which I've been doing for over 30 years, mostly as a solo show. But it's 8 different people, including me. So that's been a long time and based on all these years of listening to survivors, trying to capture some of the essence. One of the pieces that was in Someone Speaking, Mars, which I know Roland likes, is part of that play, it's really trajectory of monologues. So that's part one. Part two is What Remains, which is really from my own voice. I mean, there are plenty, as you'll hear, survivor voices in it, but they're direct quotation from people I know as I remember, and started most recently, looking back over all of these years, now about 50, of being with survivors. And as I often say, and as you said in the blurb, my approach was not the one-time testimony that's become typical, is a sustained acquaintance. So with some of these people, I've been talking not only about the war, as you'll hear, for 20, 30 years. So yeah, it's different when you know people well and when they become friends, right? People say that.
And that was also my question. Are these people that you worked with as a
No,
psychologist, or these are just people that are part of your life, friendships and family?
yeah, no, I mean, it was part of it was a dissertation originally. I was interested in the whole process of survivors retelling. And besides listening to them, like, how do you talk about this? How do you find voice, metaphor, imagery to communicate? Does anyone listen? Have they listened? All of those questions. That was a sort of, you call it academic interest at first. And I've written a lot about that. But in the meantime, I'm hearing people and I'm getting to know them. And, I did my own transcribing, et cetera. And when you do that, these voices start to almost imprint themselves. And, almost accidentally, I was asked if I could do something that was like a dramatic piece related. And I said, no, I didn't think I could. But it was obviously the bug was there.
Yeah.
So I wrote some, and then that led to another, and that led to another, and so on. So it didn't start as playmaking. It started as, let's call it oral history, but none of it was therapy. I mean, being a therapist was useful in all kinds of ways. And if I read more from What Remains, you'll hear survivors talking about it. They'll say, so Hank, you think we're crazy? I just like, oh. And then I love this guy. And then he said, of course we're crazy. You have to be crazy to go through something like that and not be crazy. Right? One of my favorite guys. But no, it was not therapy, except perhaps for me, because I got to know such amazing people. And I'm not talking about because of the war. But the folks who wanted to hang out with me that long, it's a select group, right? I mean, a lot of survivors wouldn't want to do that. They wouldn't want to speak to anybody, or maybe once is enough already. So the folks with whom I spoke at length were, call it chemistry, call it vibes, call it mutual interest, call it connection. But that's really what led to this sustained project with a number.
And have you always been a writer? Have you used
Huh.
writing as, for obviously you call this What Remains your memoir.
Yeah,
And it's interesting to me that it's the other story. So you must
right.
figure heavily in there. So you have a memoir, you
No
write
question.
plays. And so
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
have you always been a writer?
I guess so. I mean, partly because, we were assigned, but, yeah, I like writing. I mean, as we all know, it can be a very tough business. It can be a very lonely business. We all know that. But boy, when it happens, it happens. And what's even more fun, I have to say, for me, is sharing it. I love reading out loud. Well, not necessarily performing in the sense of a dramatic monologue, but I love reading out loud. Even my teaching, it wasn't my stuff, but when we would study this or that memoir of survivor, we'd often read parts of it out loud. I just think we hear better than just reading in our heads. Um, and we repeat it and repeat it. So it's that same process of taking time, being patient, listening as carefully as we can, and saying things out loud, putting writing into voice, I think really helps that process. So,
Yeah, and I think sharing it, there's different ways that people receive it, and it is received. There's that idea of sacred witnessing when somebody offers you their
mhm.
story and you take it on. How did you change from all of these stories?
You'll
What
hear some of it, and I think in what I'm going to share, but boy, in so many ways, it's my life. It's hard to pull out any particular aspect. The main thing is that I just feel it was an extraordinary privilege, and it sort of accidental that I happened to first meet a survivor. It was the first person because of another project. I was interviewing, and one thing led to another, and what would have been a 2 hour research interview became a 10-hour schmooze with two meals, and we just kept going and going and going. And it happened that, I was whatever I was, late 20s, right? That was a long time ago. Um, and they were ready, some number, to talk with someone like me. I was very much ready to hear. I mean, I knew what most people my age knew about the war and so on, but not that much. So this was an extraordinary opportunity. It really was.
Yeah,
And
kind of chose you.
I guess so. And, as one realizes when you reach a certain age, um, you look back and you realize just how accidental so much is in life. And I happened to be there at that time. It couldn't happen now, right? Because as we all know, there are, relatively speaking, a lot fewer survivors. So it's not realistic to anticipate having 30-year conversations at this point. It was possible then. So, that's the sort of coincidence of life.
And I love that you were there and open for it, and you let it become what it was
Well,
in the times, because sometimes we don't take those messages
yeah.
on. And you
Well,
did, and you were there for it, and then you turned it into something that is exciting for the rest of us
I
because
hope
it's a
so.
window into a world that many of us don't know about. And I think of it in these times, how
Yeah.
important it is, these stories, as we see some goose
Yeah.
stepping through
Yeah.
our own
Well,
country. But
uh,
I'm really happy that you're here. And
thank you.
yes, go ahead. You had something else
Well, I
to
was just
say.
going to say what we'll hear tonight, unlike Remnants, is mostly not directly about the war, but it's about life after. And It's about, as I said, it is a memoir. So a lot of it's from my perspective about
Mm-hmm.
these relationships. And as I mentioned with Abe, of course, we're crazy. I mean, some of them are funny,
Mm-hmm.
some of them are not funny, but they're all, I hope, informing. Certainly, they were informing for me, these moments. And
Mm-hmm.
of course, the whole point is that one hopes they're also informing for other people.
Yeah, and of course that's why you're here because you turned it into a memoir, and that's what we do here. But I
Yeah.
really love how you took the stories in, and then there was something about that you needed to say from your perspective, where you're
Looking
in it,
back.
where you're in the journey of
Yeah.
what happened to you, and I love that.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not going to call it the end of the road, but it's getting there, let's put it that way. And so one, again, looks back and it's a kind of summing up of what remains for me of all of this, and in a way for the survivors as well, as you'll hear. So,
Beautiful segue, sir. I'm going to take myself out of this picture, and
okay,
without further ado, it is all
thank you.
yours.
I'm going to go get my text up. So here we go. I'm going to read parts of two segments from What Remains. This is the first of them, and it is called, for reasons you'll immediately get, Gone. Most of the survivors I first met 50 years ago are gone. I'm not sure why I say gone, as though they have only left, as though they might be back. Sometimes I say they're no longer on the planet, as though they might be on another planet. It's been hard to let them go. Beyond my family, being with survivors, schmoozing with survivors, thinking and writing about my schmoozing with survivors has been the center of my life. The cliche applies. Some really were family. We adopted each other.
What?
They were short on family because of the
Don't
war.
hear you.
I was short on family, well, because of my family. But that's a different story for a different time. Augie Rubin was the center of the center, the heart of all of these years. For 8 months in 1980, we met every Monday for an interview that became a conversation, that became friendship, that became a co-authored book. We met over coffee, cigarettes, lunch, in various order. Augie was Hungarian and she cooked like one. Paprikash, paprikash, paprikash. I once gave an oral history talk called Let There Be Lunch. The point was that people often say things over a meal that are rarely said, right? In recorded interviews. And indeed, over their years of conversations, Augie and I didn't talk only about the war. We spoke about pretty much everything. We shared our lives. So whatever we discussed about the Holocaust emerged within a full relationship. Augie met all my girlfriends from those years, and for reasons I'll never know, she often remembered one of them as Diane. I never went out with a Diane. Perhaps I should have. Perhaps, perhaps somewhere there is a Diane Paprikash. Satyrs at Augie's were unique. The guests called themselves the Hungarian Mafia. Doctors, lawyers, dressmakers, shopkeepers, no gangsters as far as I know. They welcomed me even though, and then they asked me, I'm part Galicianer, that's Poland, part Viennese, and maybe a little Litvak, Lithuania. As is Passover tradition, they welcomed the stranger. Augie was very pleased with, I'd say proud of, my reconstruction of her own memories in remnants. The vanity, her story, is the anchor of the play. She came to many performances, both before and after I began doing it solo. And one of the befores was a production by a well-known professional Jewish theater in Detroit. Like many Jewish theaters doing Holocaust-themed plays and professional theaters in general, they went way over the top. If there's any topic that doesn't need over the top, it's the Holocaust. Less is more. Even less is usually even more. And after the performance, Augie sided up to me and whispered, "Never let them do it again." She took a step back and winked. "Never again." You have to be in the mafia to say stuff like that. In later years, When I heard Augie recount the experience that Vanity recalls, I realized that she told it increasingly like the version that is reconstructed in Remnants. I don't mean verbatim, but closer to its pacing, construction, conclusions. In essence, she was borrowing back my retelling of what I initially borrowed from her. So whoever was retelling the Vanity, the piece had developed between us. But then I realized that the stories we tell, especially the most important, are often co-written in one way or another. They all develop between us. For example, we share a memory with a friend, someone who knows us well, and they may suggest a metaphor, a connection, a theme that helps capture what we were trying to convey. Next time we tell that story, we may well draw on our friend's metaphor, connection, or theme without giving them a footnote. Footnotes are not needed. All that is needed are good friends and good conversation. In 2016, I received a voicemail from Augie. She was in the hospital, and she said that she needed my help. She said there was one more chapter we needed to write. It would be about all the people who had helped her through her life. It would be a chapter of gratitude. The book that Augie and I co-authored was published 10 years earlier. Of course, I knew there was no possibility of adding a chapter, but logic in such instances is beside the point. The next day I went to the hospital. Augie was dying of emphysema and barely able to breathe. She recognized me, but not much more. And she didn't mention the chapter she had imagined the day before. So this memory must itself represent a part of that chapter, that gratitude, which I return. From these 50 years of my life among survivors, Augie and others you'll meet, gratitude is a large part of what remains. Now I go to second excerpt. And this is called Human Remains. Once my wife was stopped going through airport security and asked to open a blue velvet box she was carrying in her purse. "What are those?" the guy asks. "My husband's teeth," she answered. He waved her through as quickly as he could. They were my baby teeth that my parents had saved in a blue velvet box. After her gallbladder was removed, my mother came home from the hospital with her gallstones in a small glass jar. As a kid, I'm fascinated by them. Amazing that these pebbles were once inside my mother, and now they're sitting on her dressing table, and I, who was also once inside my mother, am looking at them. Human remains. As a kid, I read a lot about archaeology, kid archaeology, mummies, pyramids. In my bedroom, there was a slit in the back of a bookshelf that led to a mysterious space behind. I discover I can slip thin bits of paper through it. I once wrote a note, "Letter to future archaeologists. My name is Hank Greenspan. I live at 34 Cooper Road in White Plains, New York. I really hope you find this. Here it is 1958. I didn't know if AD would mean anything. I put my message to future archaeologists in the slit. I hear it fall downward between the studs to an imagined moment in which it and I are discovered. I often looked for arrowheads. Once I actually found one on an island on Lower Saranac Lake in the Adirondacks. Doing the math, I realized years later that Lower Saranac is where I would have been conceived. When I found the arrowhead, I didn't know that. I was just thrilled to hold something that was held by someone else, maybe hundreds, maybe thousands of years before, maybe more. It was in his hands. I assumed it was a him, and now it was in mine. Human remains. Years ago, I had a lovely kid in my seminar on the Holocaust. She was smart, but her writing tended to go tangential. Usually she called herself I was reading one of her swervy essays in our kitchen. Suddenly, she caught herself and returned to the topic, and she wrote, anyways, back to the Holocaust. I shared it with my wife. Since then, over 20 years, when my wife or I suddenly change topics, we say, anyways, back to the Holocaust. 3 of my grandparents died before I was born. My father's mother lived until I was 4.5. I remember her apartment on New York's Upper West Side. I remember naps in a bed with a specific grandmother smell. And after she died, my parents told me that her last words were, how's Hank? I have no idea if that's true. Hope it is. Henry Crystal, an Auschwitz survivor and teacher of mine, once told me, part of what helped me survive was that I knew my mother loved me. Human remains. I understand that T.S. Eliot was an anti-Semite, although there's apparently some debate. Either way, like many, I'm drawn to this line from The Wasteland. These fragments I have shored against my ruins. Fragments, ruins. I know a Holocaust survivor who endured the Lodz ghetto in Auschwitz. Reuben owned a small electric parts store in what we used to call inner city Detroit. He told me that he could have moved his store after the '67 Detroit riots or rebellion, but he stayed. I could have moved out years back, but sometimes I just feel, I don't know. It reminds me sometimes like the buildings, all boarded up. Sometimes it reminds me like the ghetto from the riots in the city. They never did nothing to it after that. Everything is boarded up and ruined. It's a lot like in the ghetto, in Łódź. After '67, only a few customers came. Reuben spent most of each day alone in his store, dreaming back, as he said, to pre-war Jewish Łódź. He even imagined writing a novel, not about the Holocaust, but about the whole life, before the Holocaust, with the Holocaust included. Reuben never wrote the novel. I think he lived it, finding a ghetto that reminded him of that ghetto, choosing not to leave, shoring fragments from a whole life. Unpublished and unpublic, it was indeed a dream. In Birkenau, Aggie found a photo of a favorite cousin in her mother's jacket and a pile of clothes from those already gassed. She hid the photo in her shoe and kept it until liberation. By then, it was only white powder. Human remains. Aggie also had a recurring dream in Auschwitz. She was a child cradled in her mother's lap. But the fence, the barbed wire is there. It always ends with that. The good sheltered feeling is very temporary. It's very minor. That's how far you could go, even in a dream. After my sister Carol died at 52, my wife and I traveled to Boston to make arrangements. We picked out a gravesite. One could pretty much choose any plot in a new cemetery. And so my wife and I walked around talking about the advantages of the view Carol would have, keeping in mind her horizontal plane from this versus that one. View is important. Almost always we imagine it is for them rather than for us. It is a way of shoring memories and care. Human remains. Baby teeth, gallstones, fragments of a photograph, fragments of a dream, a single plot chosen at twilight. These are small things compared with monuments, memorials, museums. I've come to believe that grief is a piecemeal business, tangible, specific. We can grieve a single person we love and for whom we carefully choose a grave. But I don't think we can grieve the whole life of a people, mostly without graves, for us, mostly without names. Aggie told me that a friend of hers, another survivor, asked if she could visit Aggie's father's grave as a place to grieve her own father, lost in the flames. Agi's father survived the war, so there was an actual grave. And the friend said, she asked her rabbi, who said it was okay. And Agi said, of course, it's okay. Human remains. I was with Agi when the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum opened in 1993. A cold, wet, brutally windy day. The mole stretching out behind the new museum was a field of mud. Agi remembered. For years, I saw my mother floating in the air in the smoke and the wind, and I couldn't reach her. I couldn't bring her down. We want to feel that our dead are somewhere, and what happened to them is somewhere, and not simply erased. We want to believe that the museum is a place to remember, even a grave, even a cemetery. But I must tell you that this is improvisation. This is pretending, and we know it. We want to believe it, even as we are reminded that it is cold and it is raining and the wind still blows. We can improvise. We can borrow one grave to stand in for another. We can borrow a ghetto in Detroit to stand in for the obliterated ghetto of Łódź. We can borrow a museum to stand in for cemeteries that exist nowhere. But there are limits. That's as far as you can go, even in a dream. Agi's mother improvised during the first moments of their arrival in Auschwitz. Agi was sent to one side, her mother and little brother to the other, and Agi ran over to be with them. But the SS shoved her back, pushing her to the ground. Her mother saw this happening, even as her own line was led away. Go, my child, go. We will see each other tomorrow. Agi says, and I've been going ever since then. Human remains. These days, there is endless talk about survivors' legacies, which almost always means their testimony about what they witnessed and endured. Not so for Agi. What is that word they always use? That word, legacy, legacy. What is my legacy? We who are there know how limited can be any parent's ability to prepare the younger generation for what can happen. But then I think of my own parents, the legacy that I myself received, and I realize it is made up of small things that turned out to be precious to me, things that I gathered up as much because I needed them as because my parents wanted me to have them. I barely remember my mother's face, but I somehow remember her principles, certain ways one tries to live one's life. My father, who survives, was with me through much more of my life. It was a full, mature relationship. And yet, when I think of him, I remember certain moments. I remember the way he sang Ein Kelohenu, one of our Jewish prayers. And whenever I'm at the synagogue and I hear this hymn, I hear his voice. I remember how much joy he got out of singing that particular one. And when it comes up, he is again with me, and I'm singing with him. It is the harmony of voices that makes the legacy, the way I tune myself to him and feel his spirit singing through my own voice. Even now, we are singing together. Even now, we are singing together. So, actually, what is a legacy? It's these small things that are taken up by those who follow. I can provide whatever I can provide, but in the end, my legacy is not up to me. It is up to whoever comes after to pick up this bit, remember that part, find harmony with whatever note, as it may apply to their own circumstances, which I know will be different from mine. You will take what you choose, what you need, just as I did. I can only wish you well and wish you peace. So one last time, I remember my mother's voice, and I repeat what she said to me as she looked across the mud and the agony, trying to get my attention, trying to imagine a future, trying to invoke hope, trying to bestow the only blessing that in the end this world allows. Go, my child, go. Go, my beloved children and grandchildren. Go, my dear comrades and friends. Go, my kind listeners. Go. Thank you.